Sometimes a single decision, a single action can just signal a massive shift.
Hmm.
And President Trump's first overseas trip, that really feels like one of those moments. I mean,
Mhm.
for decades, right? If a U.S. president went to the Middle East for the first time, you expected to stop in Israel. It was almost uh, automatic, diplomatic bedrock.
Yeah, practically guaranteed.
But his trip, Saudi Arabia, Qatar,
Yeah.
the UAE, no Israel stop. First time in ages a president did that on a Middle East visit.
And that itinerary change, it's not just trivia, is it? It immediately makes you lean in and ask, okay, what's going on here?
Exactly. Why break with that long-standing tradition? What was it signaling about U.S. foreign policy in, well, arguably one of the most complex regions in the world?
A potential sea change.
Precisely. And that's what we're going to dig into today. We're working from an analysis of Trump's Middle East policy, some really interesting stuff in there. And our mission really is to try and understand this apparent pivot. What drove it? What were the potential knock-on effects, especially for that really long-standing U.S.-Israel relationship?
Okay.
So let's start right there with that itinerary. It was definitely unusual. The normal playbook, start with Western allies, definitely include Israel.
Standard procedure.
So bypassing Israel, heading straight for the Gulf states. It really raises that fundamental question. Why Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE first?
Well, the analysis we're looking at suggests that this points towards let's say, a reevaluation of U.S. priorities in the region.
Oh, reevaluation. Okay.
Yeah, and it notes that even before this trip, the relationship between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu was reportedly facing some strain.
I remember hearing about that.
Things like, different views on the path forward regarding Palestine, the influence of more hardline elements within the Israeli government. These are mentioned as factors contributing to a bit of tension.
Right. There was definitely a sense of maybe a cooling there. And the analysis suggests the White House was leaning towards what it saw as, quote, practical, less confrontational, and profitable ties with the Gulf nations.
Which brings us squarely to the money, doesn't it? The economic angle.
Certainly seems central.
If you zoom out, this analysis really highlights the huge economic connections. U.S. and Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar. It's not just about strategic location for, U.S. presence.
No, it's much deeper.
These countries pour massive amounts of money into the U.S. economy. They're huge buyers of American weapons and technology. Their own economic fortunes are pretty tangled up with ours.
Absolutely. We're talking billions, trillions in investment. And, the analysis frames Trump's perspective as very business-oriented, very focused on boosting the U.S. economy.
Makes sense.
So from that viewpoint, these Gulf nations would look like incredibly valuable partners. Foreign policy becomes a tool for, well, economic gain.
And what's really interesting is how the analysis talks about the Gulf monarchies themselves changing. They're not just, oil states anymore.
Right. They're stepping onto the world stage in a much bigger way.
Exactly. The analysis paints a picture of them evolving from regional players into pretty significant global influencers. Their ambitions go way beyond just energy now.
That really comes through in the analysis. It talks about these incredibly ambitious growth plans.
Huge plans.
We're seeing massive investment in, well, everything. Infrastructure, clean energy, tech, finance.
Transforming themselves, really.
Yeah, into hubs for digital innovation, global business, Islamic finance is a big one, and even hosting key talks on security and development. It's a far cry from the old stereotypes.
It really is. And the analysis touches on their unique governance style, too, this kind of blend of tradition and hypermodernity. Drawing on Islamic and tribal roots, but at the same time building these really diverse modern economies. It seems to give them a certain stability and adaptability, maybe?
The analysis even mentions Sikhism, this idea of governance built on personal relationships, dialogue within their own societies.
Right. It's a different model, not Western democracy, but it has its own ways of managing change, its own strengths.
So the big takeaway here seems to be these nations are now really powerful, independent players. They have their own long-term plans and significant global clout.
And understanding that context, their rising influence, is really key when you look at Trump's approach. The analysis labels it money over military.
Gaggy phrase.
It suggests his trip wasn't just shaking hands. It was a deliberate signal, a display of a new U.S. foreign policy centered on, well, business. Profit.
Which is quite a contrast to past presidents, right? Where the focus might have been more on diplomacy, alliances, maybe shared values.
A very different emphasis. The analysis argues Trump's main goal was to leverage the Gulf's wealth, their ambition, to boost America's economy, to, make America great again.
And the deals that came out of that trip, the numbers are just staggering.
They really are. The analysis lists some incredible figures. Saudi Arabia alone, reportedly over $600 billion in total deals.
$600 billion?
Yeah, including a massive $142 billion arms cell missiles, jets, cybersecurity, even military AI, apparently the biggest in U.S. history at the time.
Wow.
Plus, big tech deals. DataVolt putting $20 billion into U.S. data centers and energy, partnerships with NVIDIA, AMD, Amazon Web Services for an AI hub in Saudi, and a $50 billion fund for U.S. green energy and cybersecurity startups.
Just staggering sums. And it wasn't just Saudi Arabia. What about Qatar?
Qatar, according to the analysis, reached deals worth an astonishing $1.2 trillion, claimed to be the largest ever between the U.S. and another nation.
$1.2 trillion.
That's the figure reported. A huge part was Qatar Airways ordering 210 Boeing planes, $96 billion right there, Boeing's biggest single order then.
Incredible.
Plus billions pledged for joint U.S. ventures in things like quantum computing, smart energy, STEM education, and apparently they even offered to build a custom Air Force One for the president.
You're kidding. Okay, and the UAE?
The UAE added another $200 billion in new deals. This was on top of, like, $1.4 trillion already in the works.
Good grief.
New stuff included, like, an aluminum plant in Oklahoma, more oil and gas work, and $100 billion specifically for investment in U.S. AI companies.
So you add all that up. The analysis puts the total over $2 trillion.
Over $2 trillion. It's hard to even grasp.
And the analysis argues this wasn't just about selling stuff. It represented a shift in America's global role. Maybe less military focus, more global business leader.
That's the interpretation presented, and it suggests this approach really clicked with the Gulf states' own modernization plans. They were already thinking more about global relations in terms of trade, of economic partnership.
So it aligned well.
It seems so. Less about old alliances, more about mutual economic benefit.
Okay, but this major pivot towards the Gulf, this economic focus, it obviously had ripples elsewhere, particularly with Israel.
Absolutely. The analysis really stresses the symbolism of Trump skipping Israel on that first trip.
It sent a message.
A loud one. And it was apparently reinforced when the U.S. Defense Secretary's planned visit to Tel Aviv got canceled around the same time.
Right. So the analysis suggests that people in both Washington and Jerusalem definitely noticed. The perception was that those close U.S.-Israel ties, maybe especially the Trump-Netanyahu relationship, were cooling off.
That was the feeling, yes. And the analysis argues it wasn't just personality clashes. There were real strategic disagreements bubbling up about the region's future.
Okay, like what specifically?
Well, the analysis gives several examples. One was Trump pulling U.S. forces out of the fight against the Houthis in Yemen, reportedly done without telling Israel beforehand, even though Israel was still facing attacks from those same Houthi forces. That lack of coordination, you can imagine, caused friction.
Yeah, that sounds problematic.
Then there was Iran. The U.S. apparently started exploring new nuclear talks, using Oman as a go-between. This directly clashed with Israel's stance, which, according to the analysis, favored pressure, maybe even military options, before any negotiation. Netanyahu apparently tried to talk Trump out of it, but didn't succeed.
So a clear difference in strategy there. What else?
Syria was another point of divergence, according to the analysis. Israel strongly opposed Assad, kept conducting strikes there, held on to the Golan Heights, protected the Druze community, whereas Trump was reportedly meeting with figures linked to the opposition, like Ahmad al-Shara, considering lifting sanctions. And you had the Gulf states, Saudi, Qatar, UAE, reportedly interested in investing in Syria's rebuilding to expand their own influence. Different goals entirely.
Very different objectives.
The analysis also brings up a U.S. plan for Gaza reconstruction, apparently developed and revealed without consulting Israel first.
Really?
Yeah, it involved reportedly resettling Palestinians and building some kind of U.S.-controlled luxury resort. Understandably, that didn't go down well in Israel.
I can imagine.
And perhaps one of the most surprising points in the analysis is about secret U.S. talks with Hamas.
Secret talks?
Yes, which reportedly led to the release of an American-Israeli soldier, Aiden Alexander, back in 2023. The analysis claims Israel only found out about these direct talks through its own intelligence.
Wow. That's just a real breakdown in communication or trust.
It certainly points that way. And then the analysis floats this huge potential shift. The U.S. actually recognizing a Palestinian state,
That would be enormous.
absolutely game-changing. The analysis suggests it could reshape the whole Middle East map. Israel could find itself more isolated, while countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, maybe even Turkey,
Turkey, too?
yes, identified in the analysis as nations Trump seemed to prefer partnering with, they could be significantly empowered.
And why that preference, according to the analysis? What did they offer?
Well, the analysis frames it simply. They offered what Trump valued most: money, trade deals, alignment on certain interests, and crucially, they weren't seen as interfering in U.S. politics or making difficult demands in the same way their relationship with Israel sometimes could be.
So less political baggage, perhaps, from that perspective.
Perhaps
Yeah.
more straightforward transactional relationships. So the picture the analysis paints is this new Middle East map emerging,
Right.
where the U.S., under this approach, seemed to be prioritizing these pragmatic, profit-focused ties with Arab nations and Turkey, maybe moving away from the traditional special relationship with Israel.
This is a really significant shift from decades of U.S. policy.
Definitely. So wrapping up, what this analysis seems to show is this clear pivot. U.S. policy in the Middle East shifting focus heavily towards economics.
Big deals, partnerships with the Gulf.
Exactly. All happening while that traditional alliance with Israel seemed to be, well, cooling.
And the analysis does make a point of highlighting the upside for the U.S., potentially huge economic benefits: trade, investment, jobs back home.
True, but it also flags the potential long-term consequences. What does this mean for the U.S.-Israel relationship down the road? What about regional stability?
Yeah, these aren't small changes. They're likely to have lasting effects.
I doubt.
Which really leads us to a final thought, something for you, the listener, to mull over. When you look at these shifts, the focus on economic deals with the Gulf, the recalibration with Israel, what does the future of American influence in the Middle East actually look like now? And maybe more importantly, how might this more transactional, business-first approach impact the chances for real, lasting peace and stability in such a critical and often volatile part of the world? It's definitely something to think about.